Hello and welcome to this latest community conversation with Minds at Work. One of the aims of this community is to connect people with ideas and ways of working that can help establish more mentally healthy workplaces. But to truly have a mentally healthy workplace, you must both embrace mental health and well-being and foster a sense of belonging for all employees, regardless of gender, race, ability, sexuality, or indeed fertility. And that's why I'm glad today's guest has agreed to speak with us on a very important topic. Among those who know they're pregnant, it's estimated about 1 in 8 pregnancies will end in miscarriage. Many more pregnancy losses happen before a person is even aware they're pregnant. This loss is traumatic and can cause intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, or nightmares. It can also lead to a lot of negative thoughts about yourself, thinking and worrying a lot, and feeling lonely and isolated. For some people, pregnancy loss may be part of what causes a mental health problem, or it could make an existing condition worse. It can leave you feeling numb, angry, jealous, guilty, empty, panicky, shocked, and confused. And these feelings don't go away just because you're at work. Ruth Bender Atik is the National Director of the Miscarriage Association, and her charity has developed a lot of tailored support to help people through this experience. A lot of what I've just said comes directly from the Miscarriage Association's pamphlets. So she's joining us today to talk about the support available. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you, Lauren. And you're right, I thought I recognized some of those words.
So to start with, let's start with the absolute basics here. What do we mean when we talk about miscarriage or ectopic or molar pregnancies?
Okay, and that's such an important question, because I think we all think that we know what it is, and actually we don't necessarily. So, and also definitions slightly differ between different countries. But in the UK, a miscarriage is the natural or spontaneous ending of a pregnancy or death of a baby. It depends on how you conceptualize, this either a pregnancy or a little being or a baby to be. It's the ending of that pregnancy before 24 weeks gestation. And I think most people think about miscarriage as being something that happens in the first, 12 weeks, maybe, and maybe they think it's actually not a big deal. Even if it's not really a baby yet, but of course, different people see it in very different ways. And for many people, the minute they get a positive pregnancy test, they're thinking baby. And the other thing is that people assume, because they focus on early loss, that if you get to sort of 20 or something weeks, then that must be a stillbirth. And people may experience it, maybe experience it and would rather think of it as being a stillbirth. From a legal perspective, it isn't. And that matters because they don't have the birth of their baby, which it will be, registered. They have no entitlement to, say, bereavement leave and pay or maternity pay that happens if you have a loss a bit later. So that's a bit of a long explanation really about what miscarriage is. And I think it's important to say that it is horribly, horribly common. It is, you talked about different statistics there, and you're right. I think there's a sort of estimate that probably around 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 pregnancies end in miscarriage. And yes, most of them will happen in the first trimester. That you're still going to have a small but significant number that end much later in pregnancy, as I've said, so probably around 2%. And that's not necessarily more distressing, it's just different distressing. You can't measure somebody's reaction by the number of weeks pregnant they were. Much more to do with what the pregnancy meant for them, but also the physical experience they go through. And it's very different being induced going into labor and delivering a tiny baby than having a miscarriage earlier in pregnancy, even though that can also be very traumatic, as you said before. And so I guess, sorry, I'm on a roll here. And
go for it.
I think the other thing to say is that most people who miscarry once. Most of them will go on to have a healthy pregnancy and might have had healthy pregnancies before, but there will be people who have more than one, and maybe they have several in a row. And it's very kind of tempting to say, I'm sure it'll be fine next time. But it isn't always fine next time. And some people will not have their baby in that way.
And so you were talking there about the pregnancies themselves, one other thing that the Miscarriage Association has in its literature is talk of ectopic or molar pregnancies.
Yeah.
So could you just explain what those are?
Yeah, so ectopic pregnancy, the word ectopic just means out of place or in the wrong place. So it's a pregnancy which, instead of growing inside the sort of body of the uterus, which is where it needs to be to grow and develop, the pregnancy is elsewhere, and the most common location is in one of the tubes, one of the fallopian tubes. You know, when we're young as kids, as particularly as girls, and we see these illustrations of what looks a bit like a cow's head, and the ears and the horns, so the fallopian tubes are the horns. If you have a pregnancy that starts growing there, it can only get to a certain size before it will actually burst or rupture or tear the tube. So ectopic pregnancy is not only a pregnancy that can't survive, but it is also potentially life-threatening and can also damage future fertility. So you've got a whole lot of stuff to deal with when you have an ectopic pregnancy, including the fact that it can be difficult to diagnose. And when it is, you're going to be, in some cases, rushed as an emergency to theatre without even having time to think or digest what's happened, so that all of that happens later. And then a molar pregnancy is way less common than either of those two kinds of loss, so around 1 in 600 pregnancies. And it means that the early development of the baby has got either far too much or far too little genetic information. It absolutely can't survive, but hormone levels just keep going up and up and up, and the lining of the uterus keeps developing and developing and developing. And that, again, is not only the loss of the baby, but it's also a condition that needs specialist follow-up, because in a small number of cases, it can develop into what's called an invasive molar pregnancy, and it can lead to a form of cancer called choriocarcinoma. So you've got the loss of the baby that you thought you were having, maybe somebody telling you, well, it wasn't really a baby anyway. And then you suddenly think, I'm going to die. I've got cancer. I'm going to die. I mean, most women don't have an invasive mole, and also it is the choriocarcinoma. This kind of cancer is absolutely treatable and curable, but it's very, very frightening, and you have to be in follow-up for quite a period of time. And during that time, you're not supposed to conceive. So you can see that that kind of trauma continues. And so you were right at the beginning to talk about trauma, not for everyone, absolutely not for everyone, but in many cases, however early the loss, the psychological distress can be considerable.
So let's talk a little bit about that distress, that traumatic experience, if that is indeed the way it is experienced. And it can obviously affect both women and their partners when they go through this. So from your experience, what sort of impact can a miscarriage or one of these ectopic or molar pregnancies have on people's day-to-day lives and their mental health?
I think it starts either when they get an inkling that something's going wrong. So maybe there is some bleeding or some spotting or some pain, or they just don't feel right. And this could be really early in the pregnancy, or much maybe at 20 weeks or something. And they start having this feeling that something's not right, or a real anxiety that something's not right. And, you know, what we want to do in those circumstances is to get an answer and to find out if things are okay. And it may be some time before they can be assessed or get an appointment, say, for an ultrasound scan. And that was a nightmare, particularly during the pandemic. So there may be some beginning anxiety. But sometimes you have a diagnosis when you'd had no signs or symptoms whatsoever, no indication that something's going wrong. So actually your first reaction is shock. And for some people that is shock and tears and shouting and crying and wondering who's that they can hear screaming and realizing it's them. And for some people it's shock and a complete feeling of disbelief or numbness. And I guess then you've also got all of that, you know, the physicality of the loss. So to do not only with what I guess, the kind of person you are and how you deal with adversity. Even if you're one of these super strong people who can cope with pretty much anything, this is something that can completely wipe out that feeling of I can cope, which is also in its way shocking. So people might feel, okay, I can manage this, or I have no idea how to react. They may feel enormous distress. They may feel panic, absolute panic, and a sense of powerlessness. There's nothing they can do to change the outcome. And the physicality of the loss can itself be not only physically painful, but emotionally difficult to the point of being traumatic. And for partners too, in a different way, because they can, maybe see somebody who's miscarrying up in the bathroom and she's bleeding all over the place, and they have never seen this amount of blood. I mean, one guy said, I sit behind a computer all day. I never see, if I was an ambulance driver, maybe.
Mm.
And we know that there are women and partners who experience symptoms, if not a diagnosis, of post-traumatic stress, and others who have not only feelings of loss and grief and emptiness, but also clinical depression and high levels of anxiety, both at the time that the event is happening and, not knowing what the next steps are and what might happen next, but also thinking about another pregnancy. And being pregnant after a loss, for most people, is, I'm tempted to say is terrifying, because it can be. But for a lot of people, there is a sort of swing between being hopeful that it'll be okay this time and being absolutely certain that it won't. That's a really difficult thing to deal with for what seems like months, because you want it to continue for months. But at the same time, women say things like, I'd just like to go to sleep for 7 or 8 months now, and then just wake up when it's time for the delivery, because I cannot cope with all this time. And that's why we have resources for people who are pregnant after loss, not only after the loss itself. And they often need a lot of support just to kind of keep on going while everybody around them is saying, I'm sure it'll be fine.
That is something that we don't really think about, isn't it? What the woman's experience is like after a loss, if she then becomes pregnant again, because that is, as you say, 9 months of hope and anxiety and stress and wondering how to deal with your own body. So it's great to hear that you also help on that side of things as well. We do.
And we all know there isn't enough mental health help out there. Trying to get mental health services for anybody, for anything, is pretty tough. And there are some maternal mental health hubs being set up, but they don't always deal with miscarriage, because they're looking at things like birth trauma, which is understandable. I'm convinced that we ought to have people doing research into postnatal illness for people who've had a baby, a healthy baby, after previous losses, because I think there will be residual anxiety that will lend itself to care of the newborn.
Oh, absolutely. So speaking of that, obviously, as you say, the NHS mental health services are stretched. So that does mean that there's a role for charities such as the Miscarriage Association. So could you just talk me through a little bit about the support that your organisation can give to those going through this?
Yes, I think we there are all sorts of things that we do, but the sort of 2 key elements, and they're not really separable. One is offering support, and one is providing information. So it's support and it's not counselling. I don't want anybody to think that we're providing professional counselling. There are places that do. There is a charity called Petals, which is definitely worth Googling. Just petals as in flowers, and they do offer professional counselling. And there are all manner of psychologists and counsellors all over the shoot. If you can, you're always looking for somebody who is qualified and registered and supervised, all of that stuff. And then you have the issue of, can you afford it or can you not afford it? And, you know, you might get on the list for CBT via your GP, but that might take 3, 6, 9, 12 months to get. There are all sorts of things, but in terms of support, what we do, generally speaking, is there is a staffed helpline, just weekdays, working hours, office hours, and they answer not only telephones, as in the olden days, but also, you know, they respond to people on email. We have live chat during the day. People send direct messages. There's all sorts of ways of getting in touch. And really, that's very much about listening. I think the best kind of helpline is one where the person at the other end of the phone is not saying much. They're really listening. And hopefully saying enough that makes the person feel that whatever it is they're feeling is understandable, not normal. There's no such thing as normal. But given what they're going through, it's understandable that they feel that way. And working out with them if they do need more support, than knowing that those feelings are understandable and knowing that they're not alone, and being plugged into support services, sort of slightly the next circle out from our helpline team. So that is, we have private Facebook groups and private forum, and those private Facebook groups include 2 groups of people who are pregnant after loss in the first trimester and in the second trimester and on. And we have an online forum, which is also very secure. So, you know, so there are ways that people can get support. That way we have support groups, quite a lot of which operate on Zoom. And sometimes people join those Zoom groups, and, you know, the only positive thing about the pandemic was in making us all learn how to use Zoom.
Indeed, yeah.
And the best thing about Zoom for support groups, or for the people going to support groups as well, I mean, practically, they don't have to leave the house, especially in winter in the dark in the evening. They don't have to walk into a room where they're not going to know anybody. I have no idea how people have the courage to go to a physical support group. When they join a Zoom group, they don't have to have their camera on. They can put whatever name they like in there. They can not say a word all the way through. They might put something in chat, even if it's just a, you know, a sort of sad face or a thank you or a something. It's an extraordinary facility for helping people to feel less alone and to feel understood by others, even if their experiences are very different. There will be that which is shared. So, absolutely. Yeah, so that's the support side. And alongside that also, we've lots of resources on the website, including resources around mental health, about looking after your mental health, how to find a counsellor, how to know if a counsellor is the right one for you, but also plugging people into other resources, because, you know, Mind, for example, for issues around anxiety. So that's all the support side, and the information side kind of feeds into that, because I think the other thing about being shocked and distressed, if you're in hospital or with a medical, you know, a group of medics or something, you nod your head, but you immediately forget everything you've been told. You don't understand the terminology that's been used, but you're too nervous to say anything, or you just cannot remember what's been said, or the terms they use either feel wrong or you just don't understand them. So that, you know, we don't understand terms like fetal pole. I mean, who knows what a fetal pole is, for crying out loud? So you need it explaining. And if people use terms, which I keep hoping they won't, but they do, like they talk about the products of conception, which is essentially what is in the uterus when you've had your miscarriage, if the pregnancy loss hasn't physically occurred yet. People think, products of conception, that's my baby they're talking about. How can they call it a product? See, we're all products of conception, but that's not how you're feeling at the time. Terms like, I think that's the worst, really. Sometimes in a later miscarriage, it can be because there's a weakness in the cervix, and it's termed I'm so embarrassed to say that, but I didn't invent it. Incompetent cervix.
Okay.
It's not good to be told you have an incompetent cervix, because, you know, like you're not feeling enough of a failure already because you weren't able to do what everybody on your road seems to be able to do. And I think that's also part of the loneliness and the feeling that it must be something you did or didn't do, because you rarely get an explanation as to why that event has happened, and you assume it must be your fault. So it's all about being there for people and trying to make people feel that we are there for you and you and you, whatever your experience is. We don't make assumptions that you absolutely will be devastated or you absolutely just want information, because everyone is different and everyone is individual.
And it sounds like a real humanizing of it as well, you know, some of those terms are so clinical and just clean and, you know, not human. Yeah. And obviously you do have, as we said at the beginning, part of that information of leaflets on, you know, and resources on mental health during and after pregnancy loss and on the workplace. So given we are Minds at Work, let's maybe just talk a little bit about the workplace side of this. And we do have a visual to share on this, which I'll do in a sec. But before we sort of go into that, I was just listening to everything you were saying and thinking, trying to put myself in that position of having to tell people about this and having these conversations. Do you have any advice or guidance on someone who needs to address this in the workplace in terms of how they bring it up?
Are you talking about the person who's going through or gone through the loss?
Yeah.
To the manager.
Yes, the person who would need to come to their manager and say, this has happened.
Well, I guess the first question is, do they need to? And we know that lots of women won't even tell their manager that they're pregnant, because despite, you know, equalities legislation, quite often women feel that they might be disadvantaged in some way if they actually say that they're hoping to have a baby. Or they might just decide to keep it private, or they may not want to say anything until they're so many weeks along. So for some people, they'll be deciding whether or not to say they're having or had a miscarriage because they haven't told them they were pregnant. So the question of to tell or not to tell is the first thing that arises. And I think, apart from, you know, there are organizations where you don't have a choice. I mean, if you're working in the health service, if you're working in, in the dentist's office and you're dealing with x-rays and whatnot, you're going to have to be at some point saying something about a pregnancy. But some people just never say anything, and they might even be miscarrying while they are at work and just maybe visiting the loo more often, both to kind of take care of themselves and literally mop themselves up, and also to mop tears and shock and all the rest of it. And I think if anyone can find a trusted person within the workplace, and you'd hope it would be a manager, but it might be a colleague or somebody that you can tell if you need to go home, whether it's happening there at the time, or maybe you need to be going to hospital. But also, if you need to take time off work, and we know there are some women who just come back to work. They take a day off because they don't really have to say much about what it's for. You can self-certify or say you've got a stomach upset. And they will go, and they might go to the hospital, and most people don't stay in, but they might continue to miscarry. The process may continue. They may still have pain, and they may still have bleeding, and they may still be distressed, but they go back to work, because if they take time off, they won't be paid, and they can't afford that. We're not just talking big, humongous organizations, but, you know, maybe you're a minimal hours kind of person, and you're in that gig economy. You don't have the terms and conditions that would allow sickness leave. Or maybe you've been sick with other stuff. Maybe you had COVID and you've been off lots of time with COVID, and there's only a certain number of days that you're allowed pay. So all of these things can factor, you know, they can figure in people's decisions. I think really the bottom line is to try and do what you feel you can cope with best. Some people want to go back to work quickly and not tell anybody, not just because of the pay issue, but because they feel, do you know what? I know what I'm doing at work. I feel I have some sense of control where my body is falling apart.
Yeah.
You know, it helps them. It helps them.
Mm.
Others just cannot cope. And if they do go back to work too soon, if they take time off, but maybe not enough time that they need, and they go back to work too soon, they often say that they know they're not working to their potential, and it may be noticed, and then they may be disciplined. So I think if people can find the way to take off the time that they need, and or find somebody within the organization whom they can share it with, and in the best organizations, they will have a pregnancy loss policy or something similar. We're certainly working our socks off to get organizations to set those up. And many of them are. And actually, anybody who's in Scotland, city councils all over Scotland are adapting this, you know, are adopting the idea of having pregnancy loss policies, so that and training their staff so that people know what to say. And they don't say things like, oh, for goodness sake, you've already had a week off.
Yeah.
You should be back to normal by now, which, by the way, is sometimes what your granny says, but that's a story. So I think people need to be mindful that you're never going to do a good job at work if you're not taking care of yourself, and you're not taking care of yourself. And actually that goes for partners too. And people can always get in touch with us, and we will always be there. Well, not always, not all night. I mean, it's office hours, but we will always try to help. And there is, as I said, the resources for managers and training for managers on what to do and what not to do. And hereby comes your image, which you can share.
I can share as we talk about the support that managers and workplaces can give to women going through this. So you should be able to see that now. Yep.
Yeah. And it's kind of really simple, isn't it? It just looks so simple, but actually create a supportive environment matters a lot. It's about saying, do you know what? We realized that, oh, some of you are women, and some of you are partnered up with women, and some of you will get pregnant, and some of you might have miscarriages. And we never talk about miscarriages because, you know, it's women's stuff and it's about vaginal bleeding, and we really aren't comfortable with any of that. But we recognize there are issues here. And we have a team of people in the organization who may be able to help. So it might be a women's network, or it might be a something else network, or a well-being network. There will always be somebody whom you can talk to, and hopefully it's your manager. So create a supportive environment, and also be aware that you need to train staff, managers and colleagues in what it means to be supported. And it might only be as simple as saying, I'm really sorry for your loss, and acknowledging that it is a loss for most people. So that's the supportive environment, and it takes way longer than 2 minutes to actually say what that really is. And support pregnancy-related leave. So I talked about leave. So whether or not you're paid, if you have a miscarriage or an ectopic or molar pregnancy, and your GP or the hospital doctor will write you a sick note saying that it is pregnancy-related, you are entitled to sickness leave. Now, it might not be paid. I keep saying that because it might not, but that leave has to be it'll be recorded in your sickness record, but it has to be recorded separately from any kind of calculations that can disadvantage you. So it can't be used in anything that's going to mean you've had too much sick leave, or actually you know, you're going to be the first up for redundancy, or we're not going to offer you the promotion we were thinking of, because you cannot include it in any of that. And then when people are either in the situation or they're thinking about coming back, ask them what they need. Don't make assumptions. Keep in touch, but light touch. Say, is there anything that we can do? And it kind of moves on to the next one, to support you coming back to work. Because some people won't come back to work if they've felt unsupported completely. But others will, if you think about, would it be helpful to have a phased return to work? Is it particularly difficult for you because you're working with, I don't know, you're working in a nursery with babies? Is there another part of the nursery that you could work with? Would you rather be with the older nursery kids rather than the newborns? Would that be easier for you? Are you sitting in an office surrounded by other people who are very, very pregnant and having a collection for somebody who's about to go and have a baby? Thinking about things that can, it's not going to solve all the issues. It's not, because these feelings can last for a long time, but it just makes you feel that people will be more supportive and they'll kind of get it. And it makes it easier for you to go back in. And I think recognizing that it might take some time for people to kind of get back to who they normally are, even though it might be slightly different.
Great, thank you so much. It is helpful. I'm just going to stop sharing that. That's really, really helpful. And it's, it's something that we've spoken about a lot in our community around fertility policies, especially for people going through IVF and who will need lots of time off. So it's it makes sense that there would be a pregnancy loss policy side of things as well.
And I think quite a lot of our organizations and our fellow charities are also dealing with the same kind of stuff. We're all kind of pushing, I mean, on a generic sort of basis, well-being, and well-being includes mental well-being and being more supportive of women who are going through the menopause, women who are having fertility problems. There's lots of that. I was at a conference last week or the week before, I've lost track of the CIPD, and I can never remember what that stands for, but it's people in sort of PR, in personnel work, personnel development. And there was loads of stuff there about mental well-being and how to support people at work who have mental health problems or issues, which, as you say, can either be triggered or exacerbated by pregnancy loss or by fertility problems, or, gosh, the people who have both, they've taken ages to conceive, and then when they finally have the joy of conception and then it's followed by a loss, that's just a double blow, and maybe even a triple blow if that's their last chance of getting pregnant.
Yeah. And it is, a very personal thing, but it will bleed into the workplace as well. So
yeah, for sure. For sure. So do you know what? Even if you have the most uncaring of managers and employers, even if it just makes sense for their bottom line to take care of their staff. It's way more, it's way more expensive to be recruiting people, especially these days, because there's a lot of full people who are quite happy to pick and choose. You want to be a good employer to keep the best people, to keep everybody in your workplace.
Absolutely.
That's the way to sell it, I reckon.
Absolutely. It's all about the money at the end of the day. But one thing that you've mentioned already is employees' rights in these situations. So could you just recap for me what a woman going through a pregnancy loss is entitled to from your experience and the information you have to hand?
Okay, well, you're not going to like the answer. The answer is she's not entitled to anything. I mean, the bottom line is, unless the organization for which she works has some kind of policy that includes paid bereavement leave or paid sickness leave or paid whatever they want to call it leave, miscarriage leave, she is not automatically entitled to paid leave. She may be able to take leave, which may or may not be paid, unless you are 24 weeks or more when you lost your baby, or unless your baby died, say, was born before 24 weeks, but was born alive and then died, which was neonatal death. In those cases, you will get paid parental bereavement leave for the person who was pregnant and their partner. And then what workplaces do after that is entirely up to them. So the only other protection you've got is this pregnancy-related leave, which either is or isn't paid. And there's an awful lot of managers and actually just people in general who don't know anything about it. So we keep banging on about that too.
Absolutely.
That's a technical term, banging on.
Absolutely. Banging on. I love it. I love banging on. But Ruth, we have, HR people, HR directors, managers in the community. What would you ask of them in terms of improving that situation for women going through pregnancy loss?
I think the first thing that they can do, that you can do, if I'm speaking to you, you plural, is just to start out by being thoughtful. Think about what it might be like to experience the loss of a pregnancy, which might have been a very, very much wanted pregnancy, or it might be a completely unplanned pregnancy, but actually still you want it. What those feelings might be, and how people can be supported in the workplace through whatever policy that you can provide, but also the kind of culture that you have in your organization. Just ask people how you can help. Say that you're sorry to hear about their experience. Don't be shocked. And it's hard not to be. If somebody says, I've been off for 3 months and I need more time. And the person who was sitting next to them, who was pregnant at exactly the same time, came back within a week, because they're different people and they have different needs. And it's hard. Of course, it's hard. The Miscarriage Association doesn't have many staff, but if we have a staffer that's off, that has a miscarriage, they will have the time off that they need. They just will. I mean, how ridiculous would it be if we didn't offer that? But it doesn't mean it's not hard for us, because we're missing a core, member of our tiny team. So I think that's important. And please, please, please use the resources that we have on our website. And it's miscarriageassociation.org.uk. You have to be able to spell miscarriage and association. miscarriageassociation.org.uk/workplace. And there is loads of information and guidance on there. And we will also offer training. So, yeah.
That's great to know. And I will make sure that URL is included in the recording of this as well. Ruth, it's been such an important conversation. Is there anything else you would like to add that we maybe haven't covered?
I don't think so. I mean, the things that I feel most strongly about, maybe the thing I feel most strongly about is the individuality of loss. Always remembering that you'll only find out a bit if they tell you, because you're asking and because you're listening, and you're doing all of that without pressure. You're not saying, well, I need to know. Do you want to talk about it? I'm really here to listen. And don't look at your watch when you're saying that, because that sort of gives a different message. I think it's about understanding that this person might say, do you know, it's a blip in my pregnancy history. I had a feeling something wasn't right, and I'm glad I didn't get any further in the pregnancy, and it's okay. And maybe they have a child already, maybe they don't, but they deal with it and they move on quite quickly, all the way through to all of those different feelings of powerlessness and emptiness and failure and loss and grief and whatever, and PTSD, to people who really, really struggle and need professional help. And I think also that those feelings of loss can last a long time. And even though people recover, they don't forget. Some will, and they will deliberately just put that to one side. But for many people, 50 years on, they still remember the date the baby should have been born. They still think about who's missing around the Christmas tree.
Absolutely. Ruth, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise. And we, as I say, we will make sure all of those resources are signposted to our community. But thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I feel rather honoured.